Well, whether it's on or not, we'll be ending Mark chapter 11 this morning. We'll be starting at verse 27, and then we'll be jumping into Mark chapter 12 for a little bit. So as you find your place this morning in Mark chapter 11, verse 27, how many people here know that Baptist preachers can be a little nosy? Everybody raise your hand. I'm admitting it if you don't know it. So I was in Lifeway bookstore this Friday evening. And Becky and Chloe were shopping for some clothes. And I said, well, I'm going to run down to Lifeway and I'm going to look at some things. And behind me, while I'm in the checkout, I hear these ladies, they're talking. And they're talking about church. And so I can't help it. And I just start eavesdropping. I mean, it's not like I walked around and stood behind the bookshelf and listened to them. But they were right there behind. And so I heard then they were talking about this church that they both recently left, and they were getting back together and talking about the new church that they went to and reasons why they left this church. And they said, yeah, the preacher there doesn't like to be questioned on anything that he preaches. And as a matter of fact, he'll pull things out, and he doesn't really want you to get in and study much deeper than what he goes. And if you come back and ask him a question, then he's offended. And I feel like, one lady said to the other, I feel like we ought to go and study what the preacher's saying after church and make sure he's telling us right. And so I couldn't help it when I finished checking out. I turned around and said, ladies, I'm a pastor. Yes, read it, question, thank you, bye. So when you go home this evening, I won't be offended. As a matter of fact, I will be tickled to death. If you go home, read what we talked about, come back and talk to me about it later. And if there's something I say that does not line up, I will be even more thrilled that you corrected me, because I'm not perfect. So that being said, let's go to the word that is perfect. In Mark chapter 11, starting in verse 27, it says, they came again to Jerusalem. This would be Jesus and the disciples. And as he was walking in the temple, the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders came and asked him, by what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you the authority to do these things? And Jesus said to them, I will ask you one question, then answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I do these things. Was John's baptism from heaven or of human origin? Answer me. And they discussed it among themselves. If we say from heaven, we will say, then why didn't you believe in him? But if we say of human origin, then they were afraid of the crowd, because everyone thought that John was truly a prophet. And so they answered Jesus, we don't know. And Jesus said to them, neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. And so let's just set the context here. And we've talked about this in the past few weeks. So Jesus has made the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. This is the last week of his life on earth before he is crucified and resurrected. And so he makes the triumphal entry. He goes into the temple and he leaves, and he comes back the next day and he sees a fig tree, and the fig tree has no fruit, and he curses the fig tree and walks away and says, no one will ever eat fruit from you ever again. And he goes into the temple and he cleanses the temple. And while he is in the temple, he looks and he sees these money changers and these people that would change one denomination, one nation's currency to another, so that they could buy these animals for the sacrifices. And these animals were a substandard animal, not worthy of sacrifice. And Jesus gets mad and he runs them out. And the scripture says that he taught them as he was running out, and as he was doing these things, he says, you've made my Father's house that's supposed to be a house of prayer for all nations. You've made it a den of thieves. And so Jesus is teaching them as he is doing this. And then he comes back and they pass by the fig tree and they see the fig tree and it's wilted, and the disciples are just, wow, look at the wrath of God and how awesome this is. And so Jesus then says, yes, this is a big thing, but what's bigger is the forgiveness of God. And so now we find ourselves that they've gone back into the city. On the next day, they come back into Jerusalem, and how many people think that the Pharisees are really mad? I mean, they're incensed. Jesus has come in there and broken up their whole way of doing things. And now myself, I used to think, well, yeah, you should have. Why do they have livestock in the temple? And they shouldn't have had that to start with. And I was wrong, because when I read and studied the Old Testament, Joyce was telling us this morning that people are saying that you shouldn't read the Old Testament. Well, if you don't know the Old Testament, you won't know the New Testament. So that was my problem when I thought that they had no business having animals in the temple there in the outer courtyard. And the reason they were there is it was perfectly legal for them to have the animals there. All of this stuff was perfectly legal for them to do, but it was the way they were carrying it out. You see, Moses said in Deuteronomy chapter 24, if you live too far away from the place of sacrifice, then the animal, the firstborn animal of your flock that you would take for sacrifice, because it is the best, take it and sell it and get a premium price for it, because it is the best. Now, what I want you to do with that money, once you get it, is I want you to take that sum of money, every cent of it, and I want you to bring it to the place of sacrifice. And when you get there, you take that money and you buy another acceptable animal. Because if you live a long way away and you have a lamb that's 1 year old and you march that thing for 150 miles, is it acceptable anymore? No. It probably loses a lot of weight. It's scruffy. It may be injured. It may be lame by the time it gets there. So Moses told the people in the law, in Deuteronomy, do this. And now you have to remember, at this point in time, during the diaspora, during the time that the Jews had been spread out by the Roman Empire and different persecutions, that there were places like Ethiopia that have always had a large Jewish population down in Central Africa. And there are places all over the Roman Empire, Jews of different places. Remember, Paul grew up in Tarshish, which was a Gentile city, and moved as a young man to Jerusalem to learn at the feet of the rabbis. So there were all these different Jewish people from all these different nations that would come at the time of sacrifice, and some of them had money, currency from different parts of the world that they needed to change to buy things in Jerusalem. So everything they were doing was fine, except instead of doing it under God's authority, they decided to do it under their own. And now the Jewish law strictly forbids making a profit off of a brother. Loaning money for interest, making money off of anything that has to do with the temple is strictly forbidden. So what they do is they masquerade it as God's authority, but what they really do is they put it under their own authority. And then they come back and they have the audacity to come to Jesus Christ after he cleanses the temple and sets things straight, and they say, who gave you this authority? And questioning authority is something that has always happened and that continues to happen. In the 1960s, this is something that mankind has never shaken. In the 1960s, there was a man named Timothy Leary. And Timothy Leary was a psychiatrist who had a degree from UC Berkeley. And then he taught at Harvard. And while at Harvard, he thought that it would be a great idea to go into prisons and subject prisoners to LSD to see how it affected them and use it maybe as a therapeutic drug. And he got so carried away with it in recreational use that he started going around to the whole nation and talking to these college students and why your college would let someone come and endorse psychedelic drug use to young, impressionable minds. I have no idea. But these colleges would let him come in. And the first thing he told them was question authority. And then use psychedelic drugs. Sounds like a great idea for these college professors to deal with these kids who were told to take psychedelic drugs and then question authority, right? And we wonder now why our colleges are so out of control. But Richard Nixon called Timothy Leary the most dangerous man in America because he took values that are normal, that are good, and he said, always question authority, no matter what. And so these Pharisees, they're doing just that. What they've done is they've taken what they know to be good and solid foundations, they put them under their authority, and then the foundation, which is Jesus Christ, comes in and sets things right. And they should have known that Jesus is only doing the law in the way that Moses intended it to be done. But instead, they want to question authority. Because just like Timothy Leary, they're perverting what is good and what is right. And so basically what Jesus tells these people, what he tells these guys is, he does the old Pharisee trick. He answers their question with a question, and they can't answer. They can't answer and say whether John was from God or whether John was sent by man. And so Jesus basically tells them, guys, to quote Jack Nicholson in A Few Good Men, you can't handle the truth. You can't handle the truth. Because what you're doing here, he tells them, what he's pointing out to them is the things that they're doing, they know it's wrong. In their hearts, you can tell the debate they're having among themselves. They know it's wrong. But they want to hold this grip of authority and this grip of power. And so they like to use God and they like to use things of God, but they've got their own authority they're under, and they can't handle the truth, because what it does is it points out the sin in their own lives. I'll tell you one more story. There was a man named Voltaire. And Voltaire was a French philosopher in the 1700s during the French Enlightenment period. And he was a very influential man. If you ever read any of Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Jefferson or any of the founding fathers of America, he had a huge impact on them. Now, Voltaire was an agnostic moralist, and he just didn't really have any great answers for God. But he agreed with people that Jesus Christ was a historical figure. And furthermore, he also agreed that the teachings of Jesus Christ were pretty good. I mean, if you're a moral agnostic who says, I don't know if there's a God, how can you really argue with things if you're trying to be a moral person when you say, this man stood up and said, love everyone the same way you love yourselves? Hard to argue with, isn't it? The problem that Voltaire ran into is when people said, Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and therefore you fall under his authority. And all these moral things that he's talking about, they aren't suggestions, they're commands. And they're not optional, but they are an authority, and they are a line drawn in the sand, and they are not a maybe or a, when I want to, they are a do and a do not do. And so Voltaire, when Jesus Christ ceased being just another philosopher and became an authority, that's when Voltaire had a major problem with Jesus Christ. And that's exactly where these Pharisees are. They let him come in unencumbered and have the triumphal entry. And they're thinking, maybe this man will do good things for our country. Maybe he will fall in line and make us more powerful. Maybe he'll magnify the glory of the temple here, and he will be just like all the other rabbis. And maybe it'll be all right. But at the exact moment when Jesus becomes an authority, they have problems. And so Jesus tells them at this point, you can't handle the truth of what I'm trying to say here. Your hearts are hard. You know the truth, but all you're listening in your head, you don't want to know where I'm coming from. You don't really want to know. You ask the question and you don't in your hearts really want to know. And so over in chapter 12, he begins, and sometimes I hate chapter markers. They help us find things, but sometimes they're in the most inconvenient places, especially when you're talking the context of the scripture. So in chapter 12 and verse 1, it says, Jesus began to speak to them in a parable, because he's not just going to leave them there unanswered. And he says, and a man planted a vineyard and put a fence around it and dug out a pit for a winepress and built a watchtower. And he then leased it to tenant farmers, and at the harvest time, he sent a servant to the farmers to collect some of the fruit of the vineyard from them. But they took him, and they beat him, and they sent him away empty-handed. And again he sent another servant to them, and they hit him in the head, and they treated him shamefully. And he sent another, and they killed that one. And he also sent many others, and some they beat, and others they killed. And still had sent one he still had one to send, a beloved son. And finally he sent him to them, saying, they will respect my son. But those 10 farmers said to one another, this is the heir, come, let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. So they seized him, killed him, and threw him out of the vineyard. And then what will the vineyard owners do? The vineyard owner do? He will come and kill the farmers and give the vineyard to the others. So Jesus looks at these guys, these rich men who are so upset and who really want to know. They say, by whose authority are you doing this? And all they want is an answer that they can condemn. All they really want is for Jesus to say, well, I just kind of thought it was the right thing to do. I just, because if Jesus walks in and goes, gee, guys, did I do something wrong? See, they have the moral high ground. They have the authority. They have Jesus where they want him. And when Jesus throws it out there that, hey, guys, just maybe I'm not sent from men like you believe, but maybe I have the authority of the Father, and they start getting nervous, and their palms start sweating. And then he's got them backed into a corner. He says, guys, let me tell you a story that you're all going to get. Because these Pharisees were rich men. They were powerful. And so when Jesus starts telling the story of this rich man who plants a vineyard and he gets other people to work it for him, these guys start going, yep, you're right. Yeah, tell them. Amen. They're all about it then. Because they think he's falling in line with them. Because every one of these guys are rich guys who own property and aren't going to get their fingernails dirty. Joyce may be able to go out and garden in white pants, but most of us regular human beings cannot. And these guys are not going out in their fields because they have on their long robes that they can't get dirty with all the tassels, and they're so enamored with showing off all how clean they are and how crisp their clothes are that they're not about to go out in their fields and get dirty. So they're going, I get it. I understand. Yeah, I rent my fields out too. And so then he says, yeah, I know what you mean. I've got servants and they go out, and when it's hard, they go out, and sometimes when it's planting time, they tell how to plant and what crops to plant and which fields to plant in. Yeah, I get that. I understand. And so he started mistreating the vineyard. The man running the vineyard starts mistreating the servants that are sent to him. They go, how dare he? Nobody would do that in my field. In my field, I would never let that happen. And so when Jesus gets to the point where he says, and finally they sent the son, and remember, in Jewish culture, your lineage, your posterity, your son, your family tree, the only son that can pass on your family tree is more valuable than gold, because land, property, and everything else, it all goes to the firstborn son. And so they are totally outraged. I wouldn't be surprised if they're tearing their robes by the time they hear this, because they're not exactly sure. When Jesus tells stories, they're not exactly sure if it's a story that he's telling or if it's something that's really happening. So they're outraged. They're frothing at the mouth by this point in time. And in the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew elaborates and says that this is a question when Jesus says, what will the vineyard owners do? And they answer and say, he's going to judge them. Those people working the vineyards, they're going to get it. Death and destruction's coming their way. When my men were to get there, it all was for them. And so let me tell you what they've done for themselves. In the military, there's a thing called the burden of command. And under the burden of command, when you have authority, you're responsible for your actions. He's smiling, he knows. He's an army. And so when you take upon yourself the burden of command, there are generals who get fired for what privates do. When I was in the Air Force, There was a 4-star general that got fired because a senior airman that had 3 stripes on his arms and had been in the military less than 4 years had left a office unlocked that had a computer that controlled a missile silo. And they fired a 4-star general over that because of something a man with 3 stripes on his arms did. And it's real. The burden of authority is real. And so what these men have done is Jesus has given them the opportunity. He says, okay, you want to be an authority? You want to be an authority? I'll let you pass your own judgment. I'll give you the judgment and the authority. And Jesus takes us back. If you look at it, Jesus kind of has put this whole parable in a short synopsis of the whole world. And it says that there was a rich man who planted a vineyard. And that's God. And God created the earth. And while he was there and he created the earth, what did he do? He gave a man a little bit of authority over this earth. He gave Adam a little bit of authority. He said, you can tend this for me. You can take care of it for me. I'm going to put you in responsibility over this right here, and you're going to be responsible for it. And so what happens with Adam? First generation of people that have responsibility over the earth. The first generation disobeys God, calls him a liar, and eats from the tree. The only rule they had, he breaks the only rule that they had, and breaks fellowship with God. What happens by the second generation when men have a little bit of authority over their lives? Second generation. Doesn't take thousands of years, but by the second generation, we've got our first murderer. By the third generation, when men are given a little bit of authority, just a little bit, we not only have the first polygamist, but the first mass murderer. By the 10th generation on the face of this planet, men have gotten so bad, so evil, and so wicked, God says, I'm going to wipe it out and start again. And so under our own authority and under our own ways, these are the things we do, people. We mess up. We sin. We make it about us. And we question God. The great thing about it is that God did send his son to the vineyard owners. And now Jesus Christ has authority. And when Jesus Christ asserts his authority, there's something great that happens. Because you see, if I live my life under my own authority and all these things, I pronounce my own judgment upon myself, just like these guys, these Pharisees did. Because what they don't realize is they're the ones who are beating the prophets, who are killing the prophets that were sent to them, and they will kill Jesus Christ, the one and only Son of God. And they pronounce here their own judgment when given authority to do so. But when I turn my life over and my actions and everything I do, and I give Jesus Christ authority over my life, what does Jesus do with his authority? He dies for my sins. Jesus Christ takes his authority. When I turn my authority over to him and say, I make a mess of my life every day, and I've seen that I'm not fit to run my life by my own purposes, by my own schemes, by my own ways to advance myself, it turns out a mess every time. And Lord, I don't want the burden of authority or the burden of command in my life anymore. And Jesus says, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take command of your life, and I'm going to have the burden of command in your life. And so just like that 4-star general who took the fall for that man who had 3 stripes, the Son of God now takes the burden of command, the burden of all the mistakes, the burden of all my sins, and the burden of all my failures that I've made in my life, and he takes the burden of command upon himself for me. So when I turn around and I think about it in that sense, do I really want the burden of command in my life? No. It may look great for a little while. I want to run my life. I'm a control freak. That's why even if I was wasn't a pastor, I wouldn't drink because I don't like to stay around. I like to be in control of my life and every step that I make. But God says it's better for me to be in control. There's a humanistic atheist psychiatrist. His name is Barry Schultz. And he said in this podcast, he calls it the paradox of choice. And this man said, fish in a fish tank, when we put up boundaries in that fish tank, and the fish look out at the rest of the world, and sometimes they may think that they are losing freedom by not having the authority and the power to go past that fish tank because of the walls that are set up. But when we bust that fish tank, and all of a sudden, the fish are free to go anywhere they want and do anything they want, all of a sudden the fish aren't happy anymore, are they? Right. They're dying. In the eternal man, as we get so wrapped up in this flesh and the things that we do today and what's going on around us, we forget that each one of us is eternal. And the burden of command for mankind in his life does not end on the day we die. If you want the burden of command, it's eternal. And the burden of command for your life, if you say in my life that I choose to run my life and I choose to not fall under the authority of God, but choose my own authority, then God will forever honor your words, and he will send you to a place where he relinquishes authority. Because the worst thing in hell, yes, there's fire, yes, there's brimstone, but I heard a preacher a long time ago, me and Everett were talking about the good thing about good theology is it doesn't matter if it's 20 years or 100 years old. If it's good theology, it's good theology. I heard a preacher a long time ago when I was a small boy say, yes, there's all these things in hell, but the worst thing is nobody here has ever felt the separation totally from God that you will there. And so I want to ask you today, are there places in your life where you're holding the burden of authority and the burden of command in your life? Because I promise you, it's not something that you want. Give your life over to Jesus Christ, and he promises to take the burden of command off of you. So when these guys ask Jesus, by whose authority are you doing this? The greatest thing that can ever come to them is to say, your authority is great, and my authority is awful, and I don't want it. What I want is your authority, and I submit myself to your authority. Let's bow our heads. If you're here today and you're struggling with the authority of Jesus Christ in your life, and maybe you're not giving Jesus full authority or any authority in your life, and you like to slip your hand up and say, pray for me. I'm struggling trying to hold authority in my life. Or if you'd like to come forward and pray with us, or get with us after the service and say, I really need to let go of the authority that I hold in my life, you can slip your hand up and we'll get with you later. Father, I thank you for Jesus Christ. And I thank you, Lord, that he has all authority in our lives. That by taking authority, we turn over, letting him take authority, we turn over the burden of command to him. Lord, and that all of the decisions that we make and all the